Okay, good morning everyone. The talk that I want to give today is introductory. Hopefully it introduces themes that we will pick up on during the rest of this week. And what I want to do is really to bring to the fore the part of fisheries that sometimes gets a bit neglected, and that is the social aspect. We have our economic models, we have our environmental and fishery models, and we don't have the same sort of formal input of social analysis into fisheries advisory services often. So I've called it On the Margins, both because we're dealing with people who live on the margins of the land and the sea, and also because people involved in particularly small-scale fisheries are often marginalized in processes of government and governance which tend to be based around people who own, live on, and are available on land. People who spend a lot of their time at sea and who don't own land tend to be marginalized in a lot of the discussions about development and a lot of the development projects. And so fisherfolk are on the margins in both the physical sense and often in the political, social and economic sense as well. So if an archaeologist or a historian was looking back on the early 21st century and was interested in what we'd done with natural resources and how we'd organized ourselves to manage them, they might look at what we're going on and say, the early 21st century, this was when there was a sustainability transition in fisheries and aquaculture. People seem to have started to get the environmental sustainability of fish stocks right round about this time. We've seen stocks rebuilt here in Iceland, in North America, New Zealand, a much more functional resource management system in place. Parts of the world where this is still evolving, there's parts of the world where this is still a major deficit, a concern. But by and large, we're starting to see a range of successes in terms of conserving resources with marine protected areas, co-management, individual transferable quotas, and even with state-based management in some places. We're also seeing improving environmental standards in aquaculture. So aquaculture has shifted from an environmental villain to now being part savior of the world's demand for fish. In economic terms, there's been extensive investment and interest in property rights reform to try to regulate access, starting from declaring 200-mile limits, which is when here in Iceland they threw out the British from territorial waters, and quite rightly, so that they could control the fish stocks in their waters. So from nations expanding their exclusive economic zones towards local management, towards territorial use rights and individual transferable quotas, we've had extensive property rights reforms. We've seen strengthening global markets. Many of you studying the fish post-harvest sector here are looking at the ways in which Iceland exports its fish around the world. We've seen greater market discipline coming into fisheries, the withdrawal or the reform of subsidies, and a series of fishery improvement programs, for example. We haven't seen quite as much in the social realm. There's a lot of work to do in terms of understanding equitable access to resources, in promoting the rights of fisherfolk, not just their rights to access the resources, but their broader human rights. People living on the coast and from fisheries are insecure in a range of ways, from being subject to attacks by pirates and theft, to arbitrary arrest, to the physical risks of fishing. And we don't understand much about what people gain from fishing, except a little bit in income terms, and even there our data is patchy. So we don't understand what goods people get from engaging in fishing in terms of wider social well-being. So if we were to look back as 23rd, 24th century archaeologists, we would see the Temple of Fisheries Management here, and it would have strong economic and environmental pillars, but the social one is incomplete. So what I want to do in this talk is to start to build that pillar so that the roof doesn't fall down. I'm going to start with a couple of questions, and I think this will help us to sort of see the relevance of social analysis in considering the fishery as a social ecological system. Well, what's happening to the world's marine resource dependent societies? That question isn't asked as often as the question, what's happening to fisheries? And when people say what's happening to fisheries, they usually means what's happening to fish. Okay? And it's an irony that we actually know now rather more about what's happening to fish than we know about what's happening to fisherfolk. For example, we have better estimates of the size of some fish stocks than we do the number of people chasing them. How are coastal livelihoods changing? How are coastal and inland riparian communities involved or not in marine resource governance? And what are the impacts of change more generally? We tend to study fisheries in isolation from society. But of course, fisherfolk are parts of societies. They're embedded in local economies. They're embedded in trade systems, including global trade. Fish are part of the food system. Fisherfolk are particularly susceptible to some kinds of diseases, waterborne diseases for freshwater fisherfolk, and I will, in this talk, explain why HIV and AIDS is so prevalent in fishing communities. There's a controversy about trade and whether it enables or marginalizes fisherfolk, whether it brings benefits or excludes people from opportunities. And there is an ongoing debate about what kinds of policies are most suitable for sustaining the kinds of small-scale fisheries that we see in many developing countries in particular, but globally, and which engage the vast majority of the world's fishing people. So, as a sort of accessible entry point into the world of the social, there's a lot of different frameworks that are used, a lot of different academic ideas and theories. How many people here have a social science background, a degree in sociology, anthropology? One. Okay. Two. Okay. So some of this, feel free to add technical detail. I'm deliberately not sort of putting much kind of social theory here because I assume that many of us come from a more technical background, and so this is introductory in that way. Okay, one of the frameworks that was quite useful in linking people working on the economics and the ecology, population dynamics of fish stocks with the social and institutional and policy world was something called the sustainable livelihoods approach, which became popular around about the mid to late 1990s. And we helped to bring this framework into the analysis of small-scale fisheries around about the year 2000. Basically what the sustainable livelihoods approach does is it considers the capital assets that usually a household has as its disposal in order to make a living. Okay, so it breaks up capital assets into 5 categories. Social capital, the sort of networks that people can draw on for support in various ways. Physical capital, the sort of infrastructure that people have, roads and schools and clinics and what have you. Human capital, your training, your skills. Financial capital, savings, credit, insurance, and so on. And natural capital. Now, the bit that fishery people tend to study of this system, financial, if you're an economist, fisheries economist, and the natural capital and the fish stocks and the access to those fish stocks if you're a fishery scientist. So we weren't really considering much the other aspects of capital and how these assets were deployed in order to secure better, more sustainable livelihoods, usually thought of in terms of a more sustainable use of the natural resource base, higher income, improved well-being, reduced vulnerability, and increased food security. But the relationship between your assets and what you're able to do with those assets is mediated by a whole set of institutions and policies that can either block your attempts to make a living or can enhance them, depending on the nature of the institutional context. And one of the big stumbling blocks in a lot of development programs has been that the institutional environment is seen as not enabling in many cases. When I was working in Kenya, my Kenyan colleagues used the phrase multiple shaking down to describe the process by which people trying to make a living in various ways came up against officials who sort of blocked their attempts to diversify, to invest, and to improve their lives. So rather than decentralized government providing an enabling context, in that case, sometimes the government was getting in the way of people's attempts to improve their lives. So a lot of effort has gone in, consequently, in trying to improve laws and policies, trying to strengthen the private sector, to enforce contracts and reform tenure regimes to try to make it easier for people to build their asset base and improve their livelihoods. And then this leads to a sort of virtuous spiral of accumulation. Through improved livelihoods outcomes, you accumulate more capital, and that enables you to do more things. And this drives a sort of general economic improvement and social improvement. All of this takes place in the context of the potential for various external shocks, and people have to cope with seasonality in access to certain kinds of resources. Many of you in this group are from southern Africa, where there's a relatively short rainy season, and a lot of economies and societies are dependent on rain-fed agriculture. If the rains fail or the start time is uncertain or they end too quickly, then people can lose a harvest, and you quickly get an increase in vulnerability and a decrease in food security. So this framework really allowed us to think about fisheries in a broader way, to bring in some of these ideas which had been developed in the agriculture and other aspects of rural development particularly, and to start thinking about fisheries in this way. And although the framework draws attention to potential problems and deficits with poverty and vulnerability, it is also based around some of the strengths of livelihood systems. So one of the key strengths, and we kind of often forget this, is that the tropical coastal environments that we're dealing with support usually a very high diversity of very high production, harvestable natural resources. And not all of these are remembered when we think about the economic value of small-scale fisheries. And this woman, whose name is Monica, and whose nickname is Periwinkle Factory on account of her prowess at picking and processing periwinkles. She has a very successful small business in the Niger Delta in southeast Nigeria. And those are mangrove periwinkles. And she picked that bucket, which is worth about, I think, 300 naira, something like that. Which is, the Nigerians can translate that into dollars or Icelandic krona for us. But anyway, she was making about $4 or $5 a day from picking periwinkles, which in the context of Nigeria's poverty line was well above that. And this was a fishery which was completely unknown and neglected. And this is true, going back to gender issues, which we'll talk about tomorrow, of many of the small gleaning and gathering activities that women pursue, is that they tend not to be counted in statistics and they're therefore discounted in policy. The other thing that is often overlooked when we're talking about fishing communities and the problems with fisheries is that these are really often very vibrant commercial centres in largely cash-poor rural areas. I was struck working in fisheries with a team of agriculturalists and also working in agriculture and pastoralist villages in a range of countries across West, Central and Southern and Eastern Africa, that the fishing communities had more bustle, there was more money moving around, there was more goods flowing in and out, and yet the environment often looked poorer, and people doing surveys using assets as a proxy for poverty would often record extreme poverty in these places, but yet there was much more money in circulation. So poverty is multidimensional. This is another point that comes out. You can have economic dynamism, but you can still have poverty in other dimensions. And you could have a relatively comfortable, secure subsistence livelihood in some places, but with not enough cash to deal with emergencies or to better your lives. And that's the case in many smallholder agriculture communities. So you can't use the same metrics of poverty in fishing and agricultural communities often. You kind of have to understand the differences and the reasons for them, which we'll come back to. One of the hypotheses that you see, one of the narratives that you hear is that fisherfolk are stuck in fishing through a lack of occupational mobility. And one of the things that livelihoods analysis told us very quickly was that people tended to move between occupations. Even fisherfolk. Yes, there were specialist fisherfolk, often migrants, but even migrants had other occupations. And this is a sample, just by way of illustration, from Lake Chilwa in Malawi, where people who were resident in a so-called fishing village, in fact, only got 30% of their income from fishing and fish trading at a household level. They also had livestock, they had crops, they got income from transfers from relatives living in town, a variety of sort of service industries, self-employment, and a number of wage labour opportunities as well. So when someone is a fisherfolk, there are also all these other things. And so fishing, small-scale fishing in particular, tends to be embedded in this wider context. And people look at the economic viability of fishing and say, well, you're not making much money from fishing. But if it's a component of a wider portfolio of activities, then the household livelihood as a whole can be sustainable, even if the fishing portion looks economically marginal. But sometimes in order to make the whole profitable, you need to spend part of the year fishing, for example. And that makes the overall annual income viable. So these kinds of productivity relationships need to be understood when you're looking at development opportunities and constraints in fishing communities. I think people often misunderstand, look at the relatively low productivity of small-scale fisheries in income terms and think this is something that needs to be changed or transformed, whereas in fact, on occasions, it needs to be supported. And many people living in uncertain environments will deliberately hedge their bets by spreading their income sources across different sectors. So if one fails, you can shift more time into the other. And you see this often at national levels. In West Africa, for example, when there was agricultural failure in Senegal and Ghana, many people moved to the coast and started fishing. And when farming improved, they moved out of fishing and back into farming. And that flexibility has been important to people. Now, the key question is, how do you maintain it in an era when we're trying to improve the productivity of fisheries by making property rights more exclusive, so enclosing the commons. So this is one of the key sort of policy issues, and we'll return to that. To try to understand a little more this question of wealth and poverty, we developed a very simple framework, really, which just thought about poverty in 3 different dimensions that are related. Income and asset poverty, vulnerability, and marginalization or social exclusion. Income and asset poverty comes from ideas from Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize-winning economist, and others, on capitals and people's capabilities, what they can do with what they have. And it's really quite well measured by most standard agricultural economics surveys and the sustainable livelihoods approach. What isn't quite captured when we focus only on income and assets is these other dimensions of poverty. Vulnerability, there's a lot of interest in trying to understand more about the factors that can make people vulnerable to falling into poverty, for example, when they're doing quite well. And so vulnerability mapping has developed as a way of kind of addressing that. And people started using vulnerability mapping in drought, food security context, and later in climate change. But now it's used for a whole range of trying to understand the risks that people are exposed to, how sensitive they are to those risks, and how capable they are of adapting or coping with those risks. And the third sort of area is social exclusion. And this really is about, well, the way that relationships between different groups of people, whether it's gender relationships, whether it's the relationships between traditional elites, different ethnic groups, or powerful and less powerful countries. Power relations, the kinds of social relations between people who have unequal amounts of power, can lead to people being excluded unless there are kind of laws and conscious policies to protect them from being so. And this often happens both within fishing communities and to fishing communities in largely land-based societies. And fishing communities are often excluded simply by not owning the land that they're settled on. So if you have customary communal tenure or even individual private tenure, then you have security of access to a place to live, a place to farm, and so on. If you don't, then you can be moved on at any time. And this is one of the major problems facing fisherfolk, and is one of the reasons why you don't always see investment in infrastructure in fishing communities. People will live in temporary housing, temporary fishing camps that you see in many countries, or people settled on land that no one else wants to settle on. Marginal sand dunes and things like this. Vulnerable to then you get this spiral. Okay, so people who are marginalized then become vulnerable. People who are vulnerable can become marginalized, and so on. And understanding these dimensions and their interaction helps us to understand why, for example, fisherfolk might not be interested in engaging in long-term resource management. If they have high vulnerability to other risks or are socially excluded, they may not want to work in partnership with government to look after fish stocks, which is often the assumption we make when we design, for example, a co-management scheme. And human rights-based approaches address some of these social exclusion issues. One way of doing so. So one of the things that we also hear, I heard someone talking at the party last night, somebody asking the question, which my colleague Chris Benet, I think, asked, are people poor because they fish, or do they fish because they're poor? And the answer to that question is neither, because fisherfolk are not always poor. Yes, sometimes they are, but you cannot assume so. And we have so little data, actually, on the income levels of small-scale fisherfolk that we actually can't answer that question, except for case studies here and there. And the case studies give us conflicting pictures. All the ones that I've looked at, and that my students, like Edgar Robles here from Mexico, looked at, implied that no, fisherfolk were not the poorest of the poor. This was not an occupation of last resort. This was something that even if you had declining fisheries, you could still make money from it, And you could still make more money than you could small-scale farming, for example. So a campesino is a smallholder farmer. At this time, earning about $3 a day. The poorest fisher folk in the lowest income tercile of a sample in a village dominated by marginalized indigenous people in Mexico was earning, on average, slightly more than the average Mexican smallholder farmer. The minimum wage, they were just below the minimum wage, which was set at the time at about $4 a day for that state in Mexico. Most fisher folk were above that, and the earnings that they had were comparable to a set of sort of skilled and semi-skilled labor options in the urban economy. Okay, so fisher folk are not always on the margins in terms of income, but they can be vulnerable and marginalized. Okay, so poverty has these multiple dimensions. Same story in Uganda, for example. Kamuli district. Had somebody from Uganda here, I think. Yeah. Lake Choga. Do you know it? Yeah. Very well. I'm sure you know it better than I do. But by the time we did some work there in the early 2000s, samples of fishing incomes, asset and income surveys in fishing communities on the shores of Lake Choga were indicating that if you divided the household into income terciles in the sample, and you looked at the poorest income tercile, it was dominated by non-fishing households, and the richest one was dominated by fishing households. So in that particular context, having access to opportunities to fish made you wealthier than those people who, for one reason or another, did not have opportunities to fish or were doing other things. So that's some of the income and asset issues, at least the material ones. Think back to the livelihoods framework and some of the other dimensions. One of the key social issues that is often talked about as a route out of poverty is literacy. And one of the rationales for promoting literacy in the context of fishing communities is that if you train people to be literate, they can find their way out of fishery dependence and find other occupations. So literacy allows you access to alternative livelihoods. And literacy training for women in particular allows new opportunities in market-based economies. And we did a study of this. We pulled together a group of people who work on literacy issues. Again, there was a very common narrative that most people in fishing communities are illiterate. Very few people go to school. Kids are all going fishing and not going out to school, and so on. Again, when you start digging in the real life case studies, different picture emerges, more complicated. For example, in some of the places we were working in Nigeria, yes, enrollment of children in fishing villages in secondary school was lower than in agricultural villages. But then we dug a little bit more and we found out that was because fisher folk were choosing not to send their children to the local state school. They were sending them to private school. They were paying for their education from fishing because they valued education. They used the income from fishing to put their children through school. And in fact, some of the university professors that I worked with in Port Harcourt, their parents were fishermen. So literacy training does provide routes out of fishery dependence. Literacy is not necessarily lower in fishing communities, but sometimes access to land-based facilities such as schools can be lower, particularly if people are mobile, particularly if they're in a different language group. They can't always get education in their own language group. But my colleague Brian Maddox, who's an anthropologist, looked at literacies in very different ways, found that, okay, maybe people didn't go to the official school, but they went to Quranic school. So they were literate in Arabic, but not necessarily in the language of their culture. And when you look at canoe decorations and things, or you had someone saying in a survey, yes, I'm illiterate, I didn't go to school, and they're texting someone on their mobile phone. Okay. So hidden literacies and unofficial literacies, again, it's very difficult to measure, and there's a whole debate in the sort of education literature about what is literate and illiterate. So many people in fishing communities may not have received much formal education, but can be functionally literate. These are just illustrations of some of the social dimensions that are of interest when you're trying to work with a fishing community, trying to understand something of the social context, and trying to leave behind some of the received wisdom, much of which is wrong. There's a lot of received wisdom about, what fishing people are, what they do and why, and where they are in terms of status of this and that. Very little of it is backed up by fact when you start digging. We're lacking systematic social research. The needs and context are changing as well in fishing societies. At one time, maybe people didn't need literacy. They were isolated, supplying local markets, fishing for subsistence. But all of that has changed. Managing perhaps through local customary institutions. But now they have to do a whole range of things which require literacy. So, you might need to read the Safety Standards Manual for Small-Scale Fisheries that ILO have published. The Guidelines on Rights to Decent Work, for example. You have access to price data now, which you need numeracy and literacy to be able to access. The use of digital information systems. If you're participating in an eco-labeling or a fair trade scheme, you need to understand the conditions, you need to read the contracts, these kinds of things. Literacy confers an advantage. Those who are not literate tend to be excluded from these kind of global value chains. One of my former colleagues worked in South Africa and found that many people were excluded from decentralized governments, from local resource management, co-management schemes, because they were illiterate, because they couldn't read the agreements that had been made with government. And so, it was quite easy to cheat people out of their resources. And there's been a long history of encounters between literate people and their written contracts and people who don't have a written tradition, but an oral tradition. And the people with literature and contracts and pieces of paper swindling those without out of their resource use. Colonial powers did it all over the world. North America and Australia, it was done to indigenous people. There's also a huge amount of information that comes in terms of responding to shocks like storm warnings, market shocks, disease epidemics. Yes, we have radio, we have other ways of transmitting this information, but news bulletins, text alerts and things are becoming increasingly common as well. Okay, so just some examples of income and asset poverty. Looking then at vulnerability next. So I just want to focus on one aspect. There are many things that people are vulnerable to. I'll just pick one example, and it's one that surprises some people, and perhaps some of you less surprised. But I was working in fishing communities in East Africa, and people kept telling me that, HIV has become a problem in fishing communities. But there were very few official statistics around. Again, we started to dig, we started to find studies that had been done in fishing communities and with other groups at risk. So this is a rather complicated diagram. We did a systematic review of all the epidemiological data available. This was around about 2005. This is published in the journal AIDS, by the way. And we found data for 10 countries, and I've just illustrated 4 of them here. And what we found were these were the national adult seroprevalence rates in brackets here at the time. So 6.7% in Kenya, 0.1% in Indonesia. The figures in brackets, these are percentages, the figures in brackets at the ends of each of these columns are the prevalence rates of these different groups. And the size of the bar relates to the number of persons likely to be infected in those populations. So it's a function of how big those groups are. Okay, so for example, let's take Indonesia. Prevalence rates of fisherfolk around about 1.4%, so more than 10 times the national average. Lower than groups like prisoners and injecting drug users, but the population of fisherfolk is much bigger than the population of injecting drug users in Indonesia. Indonesia has, I think, 500,000 fisherfolk, or 1.5 million, I forget, anyway, a lot. And so even that low prevalence rate translates into a large burden of disease. It's a lot of potentially infected people. And the same is true in some of the other places. So, higher prevalence rates. The red column is fisherfolk. In Thailand, 4 or 5 times more than the national average. In Uganda, similar to another group considered at risk, military, for example. We didn't include sex workers in this, by the way, because it's almost impossible to classify what a sex worker is. And we'll come back to that. But, some very high rates. And at the time, nobody was providing fishing communities with sexual health services, with prevention, treatment, and care more generally. So this was a neglected population. So one of the reasons that we published these statistics was to try to get people like UNAIDS, the National AIDS Councils, PEPFAR, the president's, I can't remember what it stands for, and so on, to invest in providing services for fisherfolk. And the countries around Lake Victoria in particular took a lead on this, and Uganda, I think, was the first to develop a sort of specific program of targeted support to address both the underlying causes of these high prevalence rates and also to lessen the burden of illness on these communities. So, at the time, people were trying to develop co-management in situations where you had very high prevalence of people who were not likely to be around to benefit from, managing the resources with restraint now so that there would be more fish in the future. Yep. Sorry.
When you say fisherfolk, is it just the fishing people or like the vendors?
This includes both. So it was a little difficult to get consistent samples. The people who were tested varied, and the sources of the data varied. So in some cases it was a sort of random survey of all the adult population. In other cases it was many seroprevalence figures are calculated on visits to antenatal clinics where women are tested, so they're based on women, and if they're HIV positive, then their partners may come in for testing on a voluntary basis. So, it's very difficult to get really accurate figures, but this was the best that we could do. We worked with some epidemiologists and health economists on this to try and make sure that we only used valid samples. There's a huge number of anecdotal surveys out there, but these were the ones that were considered to be a bit more reliable. There's a lot of new figures have come out since, and these figures have been borne out elsewhere, including in the US, actually. The port of Gloucester in Massachusetts had a high HIV prevalence cluster. So it seems to be something that's reasonably consistent. And of course, the next question from a social point of view is why? Slide has got out of sequence, but just to put that risk into context, this was a study that one of my PhD students did on Lake Victoria, on the Sese Islands, and a community near Entebbe as well, and looked at the risks that people were facing. So this is a partial measure of vulnerability. And the conventional narrative is that people should be worrying about the fish stocks, the state of the fish stocks. And that's, of course, what all the fishery departments worry about. They say, okay, this is where we must intervene to prevent the decline of fish stocks. But you can see that people were worried about a bunch of other stuff as well. Okay, they faced this broader risk context. So understanding something of that helps us to understand that sometimes the state of fish stocks is not the most important thing in the minds of fisherfolk. You might think, well, it's their livelihood. Of course, they have to think about that first. But no, there are sometimes more immediate risks. And people will sort of trade those off against, the risk of decline. And there's a certain amount of denial. It's the fish stocks will come back, God willing. So, people face this highly uncertain environment, and it's rational in that context not to invest too much in managing the sustainability of the resource, because you don't know whether you're going to be around to collect the benefits of that. And, that's basically, economists among you will recognize discount theory, and going back to, basic economic theory developed in the 19th century around the impacts of risk on savings behavior, with John Stuart Mill and others, for example. So, going back to why are fisherfolk so vulnerable to HIV and AIDS? Well, here was one explanation, which encapsulates, I think, some of the issues there. We have high mobility. So fisherfolk are away from home. There's opportunity, there's loneliness, there's all kinds of things that might drive people to spend their time in bars and brothels and trading centres which build up around fishing communities. And people have access to cash, alcohol and drugs, which reduces your ability to make good decisions. Some of you will know this from your younger days. And so people, were taking risks, higher risks than was necessary, and this vulnerability then spreads to people within the networks of fisherfolk and fish traders. And these impacts then sort of multiply out through society. So the individual who becomes sick has a declining ability to work, might be isolated and stigmatized in their community. Their household suffers a reduced income. They have to spend their savings. They have to sell their assets. You get an increase in dependency ratio, fewer people in the household working relative to those needing to be supported by those who can. Increased vulnerability, decreased food security. So at the level then of the community or the fleet, if it's a commercial fishing fleet or the firm, you get a loss of labor and expertise, reduced efficiencies, reduced trust and cohesion, reduced capacity for collective action. And you get a whole set of ramifications which could impact on the sustainability of fisheries more generally. So we can see that a kind of something that is not in your fishery management textbook is of importance to managing fisheries. And this really we have used to try and illustrate the fact that you do need to make the connections between what's going on in the fishing sector and what's going on in society and community particularly. So this is a case really for understanding a little bit more about fisherfolk than just their fishing activities. And since then, there has been quite a lot of intervention. And it started really with awareness raising, and some of the NGOs we worked with here in Pointe Noire in Congo-Brazzaville. Communities put on plays to starring, sort of improvised acting, members of the community themselves. So these are fish traders and fisherfolk playing the parts of, in this case, the kind of transactional sex, which is one of the sort of institutionalized forms of vulnerability in some fishing communities, which is, fish trading is a highly competitive activity for women, quite easy to get into in terms of low barriers to entry. The supply of fish can be limited, and so to try and secure contracts with particular boats or with crew members, women fish traders would sometimes become the girlfriend of a crew member and perhaps in 2 or 3 boats to secure supplies. And some of you from Western Kenya may know that this was institutionalized in a system called Chaboya, is it? Chaboya. Yeah. So, these kinds of relationships happen when you have a context like this. We'll talk about this a little bit in gender tomorrow, where you have a strong gender division of labor, unequal bargaining power between men and women in lower margin, more competitive economic activities perhaps, men controlling economic resources, in this case fisheries. All of this system has been addressed to some degree with a range of interventions, many of them led by some of the people that I worked with were Kenyan doctors and lawyers who had grown up in fishing villages, saw what was happening in their home village, took action, hooked up with medical NGOs and medical organizations to bring resources and support to fishing communities. I think the important thing here has been to avoid the kind of moral condemnation that was a knee-jerk reaction in some quarters, and to sort of look at the underlying problems and say, well, this is something that we have to deal with here in the interests of wider society as well as these communities. And finally, the third dimension of our sort of three-dimensional poverty analysis is marginalization. And some of the reasons why particular individuals in fishing communities or particular communities get marginalized include women sometimes get marginalized in fishing-related activities. In fish trade, typically what we've seen is where fish trade is not that profitable, women do it. If there's a connection then to a profitable urban or international market, and there's more money to be made in it, men kind of tend to move in then. It becomes more interesting. And then there are sort of caste, class, ethnicity, occupation, location, HIV status. All of these can be used to exclude people, and that exclusion then makes them vulnerable, erodes their assets and their income, make opportunities, erodes their livelihoods. So understanding the relationships between these things is really important, and breaking these vicious cycles is important. Some of the ways that you can be excluded. You can be excluded from the economy. For example, by not being allowed to own land or to access land, or by not having rights of access to aquatic resources. You can be excluded from participation in various social fora. You might lack access to social services, for example, to safety or security, lack of access to justice. And you can be excluded from politics. Many fisher folk are non-registered migrants. A lot of fishing is traditionally migrant. If you look at the coast of West Africa, people are often fishing in countries other than their own. And they have no rights as citizens. They don't pay taxes, which is a plus for them. But when something goes wrong, they have no rights. They can be kicked out when it suits people to kick them out. They can be made scapegoats for things. So the economic opportunity of fishing comes with a high vulnerability, and social exclusion makes people vulnerable. So for that reason, we've recently been emphasizing a lot with FAO a broader consideration of issues of rights, not just access to aquatic resources, but rights to the land that people are settled on, so that they're not moved on when somebody wants it for a tourist development, for example, or wants to, take that piece of land for other purposes. So this issue of human rights has become prominent in recent years in fishing communities, and one of the reasons is that we find, again, disproportionately high incidences of human rights violations. Now, child labour is a tricky one because there is a knee-jerk reaction, particularly from people in Western countries that see any child working and think, that's terrible. But our own Tumi Thomason was sent to work on a farm at age 10. Was he a child labourer? Or was he learning a skill, acquiring independence, acquiring confidence, acquiring a set of skills, and developing as a citizen, connecting to his cultural roots and so on? So we have to ask more complicated questions when we see children working. Now, ILO and others have since more carefully defined child labour to distinguish it from children's work. And child labour is essentially anything that is harmful to the development of the child, that excludes them from opportunities, that puts them in harm's way. Even using these criteria, there are high numbers of child workers in fishing communities. One of the ones that came to very broad international attention was very young children working in Lake Volta, which is a reservoir in Ghana. And Lake Volta, as a flooded reservoir, has a lot of tree stumps and things. And small children were being sent to dive down to free the nets, and were sort of working for very little money, very vulnerable, high rates of accidents. And there was a suggestion of child trafficking to get children into these positions. But in fact, again, it was more complicated than that. Many of you who are familiar with West Africa will know that, it's traditional that you send your children sometimes to live with the family of your relatives to get schooling, to access new opportunities, to share the burdens and vulnerabilities among the extended household and not just the nuclear household. So some of these children were living with relatives and were rescued from their own relatives' houses, sometimes against their will. So again, this is an area which a deeper level of understanding of social difference is needed before taking a sort of blanket policy approach. But it was a serious enough issue that people have documented child labour in fisheries across the world. And we recently, it's a paper that's just coming out actually in a journal called Global Environmental Change, documented a range of human rights violations or claims of violations in the fisheries sector. And some of them included, as I said, child labour. For example, at one point, children made up more than 30% of fish processing workers in Thailand, according to a study by a Thai group. And, this closed down Thailand's shrimp exports to the US and to Europe, because in protest of the employment of child labour. So it has huge economic consequences. So understanding these things and what's going on in fishing communities is, again, really important. We've seen forced labour on board, particularly illegal industrial fishing boats. Migrants also forced to work, and evictions. Tumi may remember the fishing community evicted on the shores of Lake Malawi next to a luxury hotel. The hotel owner wanted to develop that land, was concerned that a nearby fishing village was causing nuisance to tourists, and so basically managed to forcefully evict an entire fishing village from that site. And this is a small-scale case study of what was happening throughout, particularly areas where waterfront, beachfront land was in demand for tourism, for the homes for urban people who want to come and enjoy the beach at the weekends. The beaches that used to be inhabited by fishing communities are now inhabited by tourists. Those of you familiar with the coast of Kenya, I didn't put the picture in actually, but there's a fishermen's cooperative and the sign is painted on a wall of a big villa, and it's the only part of the foreshore that they can get access to. There's a big, all the foreshore land is essentially taken for hotels and luxury houses and things. And the fisherfolk have to access the beach through some narrow corridors between these houses. So being pushed out, in many cases, into marginal land, into swamps and things is a common experience. So the quality of life deteriorates through this lack of rights to work on the land that they're settled on. And we also have issues of transboundary detentions without trial. Australia is often in the news in this context for arresting Indonesian fishermen in disputed territories between the two countries. Indonesian fisherfolk, incidentally, have been fishing in Australia since before settlers came. There's documented evidence that the Bajo, the sea gypsies, many of whom are based in Indonesia, were trading sea cucumber to China with the Aboriginal peoples several hundred years before European settlers arrived in Australia. And when European settlers arrived, they disrupted that trade, thereby cutting off a source of income for Aboriginal people, marginalizing them, but also kicking the people who'd had traditional access to these resources out. So, you know, some of these conflicts have long historical roots. Okay, so just to summarize some of that. Well, fisherfolk are not always the poorest of the poor, at least in income terms. What they own, in terms of the quality of their housing and so on, which is often used as proxy surveys for poverty, is strongly mediated by their rights to land. So fisherfolk won't build a big fancy house with their money if they know they might be kicked off there by a landowner any time. So that's why you often see in a fishing village no investment in drains, infrastructure. I remember I worked in Indonesia, and my Indonesian colleague, who had worked only in agricultural communities, came into a fishing community with us and said, "These people are disgusting. They haven't even built a mosque. They haven't subscribed to a mosque." And then when she understood that, they were there temporarily, they weren't sure. They did have a mosque, but it wasn't very fancy. It was just a grass hut. And for her, that was a basic indication of a community that had some pride and dignity, was that you would build a fine mosque. You would get subscription from everybody to build it. So, and in fact, when we looked more closely, what people were investing in was gold. So the women were all covered with gold jewelry in this fishing village. They were living in shacks. They all had big colour TVs and covered in gold jewelry. When the fishing was going through a bad season, all the gold jewelry disappeared. Yeah. So you invest in capital that you can liquidate easily, not in things that make you more vulnerable. And mobile populations are the same everywhere. Many cases, fisherfolk, although have the potential to generate wealth and contribute to the economy, do so less than they might because of a range of political and social marginalization issues. A lot of fisherfolk tend to be minority, a different religion or ethnicity than the land-based populations in their countries. Not always, but sometimes. And that is one of the factors that contributes to their marginalization. There's inequity within fishing communities, and local, often land-based elites sometimes capture the rights from community resources. And because fishing settlements are often informal, they don't necessarily benefit from government-funded infrastructure and support services. So the lack of health and education facilities that lead people to think of fishing villages as places of ill health and low education. And there's all the physical risks. We'll talk about climate change in one of the future sessions. But people who live on the coast, they're exposed to every form of climate change, everything that the sea throws at you and everything that the land throws at you. So you've got sort of double exposure. Okay, so that's kind of social issues within fishing communities. I want to look just before we finish. I should check the time.
It's about 11 o'clock.
11. Okay.
We can either take a break or...
Yeah, we can take a break. Depends what people have to get off to. Do I press pause somewhere? Yeah.
Pause.
next one.